so good for you, and it's so worth it. Oh, the end of the line. Hey everyone, MinerBiker here. So if you've been following me here on YouTube or over on Instagram for the last year, you know that about a year ago I put an MRP hazard coil shock on my Sal Peak enduro bike. Now, a year later, I've decided to switch back to a RockShox Super Deluxe Air Shock. I know this decision goes against the current trend in the sport, where we're currently seeing tons of riders from amateur to pro putting coil shocks on their bikes, and there are a lot of riders and other industry people who will tell you that a coil is hands down better than air no matter what. In my experience running air for years, then running my coil for the last year, doing all sorts of riding, and now being back on air again, there are pros and cons to both coil and air, and overall I feel like the air suits most of what and how I ride the best. Granted, I'll happily admit that I'm not exactly a typical rider, as I do a huge variety of riding and often ride places, distances, and terrain that most people do not. The decision to go with RockShox is mainly because I already know how to service the RockShox Super Deluxe. It matches my Lyric fork, and I've just always been happy with their reliability and performance. I did also put a new Lyric Ultimate fork on this year to replace my very well used old Lyric. So let's look at coil versus air based both on my experience and on some undeniable facts about the differences between the air and coil. I imagine a lot of this will also apply to coil versus air forks, although I've never actually ridden a coil fork. This is not a review of the MRP hazard in particular, which I was very happy with and had no issues with, but it just addresses coil shocks in general. Overall, I feel like air shocks are better for people who like to pop and play on the trail, and coil shocks are better for people who just like to plow and go fast. On extremely long bumpy descents, some air shocks can fade a bit and won't perform as well, but with a bigger piggyback style air shock, this is rarely an issue, but it is a complete non-issue with coil shock when it comes to fading. It is also true that coil shocks do have better compliance at the start of the stroke, which is noticeable in small chattery bumps. However, I never felt like this small bump compliance was hugely superior to a well set up air shock. It is better, but not the astronomical improvement that a lot of people make it out to be. On bigger bumps, I always felt like both types of shocks performed similarly, and on large impacts like drops, I actually prefer the air because of the ability to tune the progressivity and bottom out resistance. It is true that you can get progressive coil springs now, but personally I like the easy adjustment of just adding or removing volume spacers from my air shock to get just the amount of bottom out support I want. The same goes for setting the shock up with sag and for rider weight. Air shocks are just so easy. Just set the air pressure to get the sag right and you're done. Coils can be a bit more difficult, trying to find the right spring rate to match not only your weight but also your bike's suspension design. You can get a Sprindex or something like that that gives you the ability to adjust your spring rate somewhat, and a lot of people do like to go that route. When I was running my coil shock, I did run into some issues because during the week I might be going on shorter rides after work without much gear or supplies, but then I would go on a big weekend adventure carrying tons of gear and supplies, especially lots of water, and my bike would be carrying significantly more weight than normal. And with an air shock, I could just easily add a few more PSI if needed to keep the sag where it needs to be. With the coil, I felt like I was always either undersprung on my big rides or oversprung on my shorter rides without the ability to easily adjust. Going along with my doing big, long, crazy adventure rides, often with a lot of climbing and hike-biking, the extra weight of the coil did play a factor as well. I'm certainly not a weight weenie about my bike, but I don't want weight that I don't see benefiting me in terms of performance or durability, and that was the coil shock for me. When it comes to climbing in general, I never felt a huge difference. Both shocks climb just fine, although the coil does seem to want to bob a little bit more and doesn't feel quite as supportive when standing up to pedal, which I like to do a lot. However, that usually has way more to do with the suspension design than shock type. Again, the coil is heavier, so on long climbs and on big days it can have a negative effect, The MRP coil I use does have a lockout on it like air shocks do, but I rarely ever use a lockout on my Sal Peak, so that didn't really matter too much. Another thing that was important to me, but that won't matter to a lot of people and probably won't even be possible on most full suspension bikes, is the ability to carry 2 full-sized water bottles inside the front triangle. The Sal Peak is unique in that it has the capability to do it, but only with certain shock configurations. Most people with this bike use smaller bottles and they generally fit pretty easy, but I like using bigger bottles to carry more water for both me and my dogs. With the air shock mounted with the piggyback towards the front, I can just barely fit 2 full-size bottles in my large frame. And in this configuration, the piggyback part of the shock doesn't move when the suspension moves. However, with the coil shock, frame clearance necessitated mounting the coil with the piggyback towards the rear. And while the bottles would both fit with the bike just sitting, when the suspension compressed, the piggyback part of the shock moves forward and would hit the down tube bottle. So I was only able to run 1 bottle with the coil shock. Again, this is an issue very particular to me in this bike frame, but it was a big deal to me. One other thing that is often mentioned in the air versus coil debate is service intervals. Both air and coil require damper services, generally around 200 hours depending on the manufacturer. But air shocks do also have manufacturer recommended air spring or air can services, usually around every 50 hours. For some people, it's a big deal that a coil shock can go longer without needing service. For me, I find it easy to do the 50-hour air can service on the Super Deluxe myself, and this small downside of air is not a significant factor for me. So basically, despite what some people might say, neither coil or air is absolutely better than the other. Each does certain things better than the other, and each has pros and cons to it. So ultimately, it comes down to riding style and personal preference. For me, I'm happy to be back on an air shock, even though I did really like riding the coil for the past year. I'm not one to care too much about the current trends or what the cool things are anyways. So thanks everyone for watching. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and check out my other videos. And keep getting out on your bike, be it coil or air sprung or a hardtail, and dig up some new places to ride.